Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. My name is Brian Stretch. I'm the Acting United States Attorney here in the Northern District of California. I'm joined today on my immediate right by Ron Davis, the Director of Community-Oriented Policing Services Office, a division of the DOJ headquartered back in Washington, D.C. Director Davis has been appointed by the President to be the Executive Director of the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing. Next to the Director is Noble Ray on my far right. Chief Ray reports directly to Director Davis and is the Chief of the Policing Practices and Accountability Initiative Division, also known as PPAI. The creation of PPAI follows a recommendation of the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing, and it will oversee collaborative reform. And it will assist law enforcement in developing strategies to implement the President's Task Force recommendations throughout the country. To my left, I'm joined by the Mayor of San Francisco, Ed Lee, as well as the San Francisco Police Chief, Greg Suhr. This afternoon, city officials and federal authorities are jointly announcing the start of the DOJ's Collaborative Reform Initiative for Technical Assistance Program for the San Francisco Police Department. The review is in response to requests made by the mayor, from the chief, from elected city officials, and community members asking the Justice Department to examine the San Francisco Police Department and their use of force and their practices. The collaborative reform will focus on San Francisco's Police Department's operational policies, its training, its practices, and accountability systems pertaining to stops and searches and to the use of force. Importantly, the review will examine whether racial and ethnic disparities exist with respect to enforcement actions taken and not taken by the San Francisco Police Department. Director Davis will explain in further detail about the program, but you should know that both the mayor and the chief have requested an exhaustive and transparent review of the San Francisco Police Department by the Department of Justice, and that is what they are going to get. Now let me say a quick word about the calls for a separate and federal investigation into the shooting death of Mario Woods. Immediately following the shooting, our office and the District Attorney's Office were in close communications and jointly determined that the District Attorney's Office would pursue and lead an investigation into the shooting. Following well-established DOJ civil rights protocols, the FBI and our office continue to communicate with the District Attorney's Office, and we are monitoring the investigation. At the conclusion of the investigation, the federal authorities will undertake a full review. If, after that full review, we have identified an unvindicated federal civil rights interest, then we will pursue a separate federal investigation at that time. And now I'll ask Director Davis to provide some details about collaborative reform. Director?
Thank you, sir. Good afternoon, everyone. Now, this is a tight room, nice and cozy. Here we go. So as the U.S. Attorney has mentioned, my name is Ron Davis. I'm the Director of the Department's Community-Oriented Policing Services Office. In short, the COPS Office was created in 1994 with the primary task of advancing community policing nationwide. And we do this through grants, which so far we've put out over $14 billion in grants, and through technical assistance. We're here today to announce the Collaborative Reform Initiative, which is a program that is offered through the COPS Office, which provides the kind of assessment and technical assistance that was requested. Before I get to that, let me just say where we're at and why this is important. Clearly, as we look at policing across the United States, we're at a very defining moment in our history of American policing. We have, and understandably and deservingly so, high calls for increased transparency and accountability in the way that police do their job and how they engage our communities. In response to these concerns, in response to tragedies that occurred in Ferguson and in New York, President Obama last year put together the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing. Since that time, the task force has put out a report that has 59 recommendations for police departments to consider as far as implementing. As one who served as executive director, we believe that our job is now to make sure that we can help law enforcement implement those recommendations. As Brian mentioned, in response to the President's task force, we created a policing practices and accountability initiative in which we then appointed Noble Ray, who you hear from a moment, to work with the over 16,000 law enforcement agencies in the United States, that's law enforcement agencies and sheriff's offices, on the best ways to implement these transformational recommendations and how to build trust. This is about building trust and confidence in the community, a priority that clearly the President and the Attorney General have made one of their top priorities, if you will. And so when we look at collaborative forum, this San Francisco will be the 10th site of all the cities we're working in. We're seeing that it's working around the country. Noble Chief Ray will get into the specifics of it, but I really wanted to outline that when San Francisco asked for this process, that in deciding to do this process, it was a process where we talked to the Attorney General, we talked to the Civil Rights Division, and we looked at where San Francisco was at. We looked at the type of elected leadership, the police department leadership. We looked at the elected leadership at whether it's the police commission or whether it's the board of supervisors, and came to the conclusion the best services that we could provide San Francisco at this specific time and look at community leadership is through the collaborative reform process. And so this review will be independent, it will be comprehensive, it will be very thorough. You will see a very candid response of what is and what is not working, and it will help equip the San Francisco community to better understand where their police department is at and to empower them to hold the department accountable, not just to the law, which is very important, but candidly, in our assessment, the law is a lower bar, but to the best practices of the policing in this country, so that you have a police department that can become a model agency in 21st century policing. That is our goal, that is our objective, and the first thing we do to accomplish that is by making sure that we, in fact, do engage in a very thorough assessment. I just want to make sure that, before we get to questions and answers, before Noble gets up, that you also keep in mind that San Francisco has a unique opportunity, that as you are dealing with the challenges that are not unique to San Francisco, the challenges of trust and losing trust is unfortunately happening all over the country. We know that. We know that many of our communities, especially communities of color, feel like they're disconnected, disenfranchised, and do not have trust in the criminal justice system. And as we tackle this around the country, it is our hope that the lessons learned from San Francisco, the lessons learned from the other sites that we're engaging, will help also guide the 16,000 agencies so that we become a better profession. And so the best way to do that is work closely with the community, the elected officials, and really understand and delve deep into the department. What's working, what's not working. We'll have a public process so you'll know exactly what we see, and then to come up with the kind of recommendations that will help transform the department so that it's a department that you'll be proud of. It's a department that will serve all of San Francisco, and it's a department that can be a model for the nation. And so these may seem like ambitious goals, but they're not. And in asking for this, we always tell the department and the chief and I have had several conversations to make sure he knows exactly what he's asking for. He's asking for transparency. He's asking for accountability. I tell all of the chiefs, the truth hurts. We know that, but selective ignorance is fatal. Not knowing, deciding not to know, and deciding that you don't want to know the truth can be fatal to a police organization and be completely fatal to the relationship between law enforcement and the community. This is about an opportunity to redefine policing and public safety in San Francisco. From our point of view, public safety cannot just be the absence of crime. It must include the presence of justice. And the only way to do that is to make sure that the department is living up to these standards, the standards of the best practices, that it is accountable to the community, is it accountable to the elected officials, and that you have the confidence and its ability to provide those kind of services. This is the first step. I don't want to oversell. This is the first step. It is a voluntary process, so it's going to require commitment on behalf of the city. And when we decide whether or not to come into a location, part of what we look at is that we need to see that commitment, not just from the police chief who made the request, not just from the mayor who made the request, but we have to have confidence that the whole city, that the community wants that kind of transformation. They're going to be engaged because they play a very significant part in our process, from elected officials, in this case, the board of supervisors, the police commission, the appointed officials there, that everyone has to be committed to reform for this process to work. If they're not, then it's really not a good process. But we're confident right now. We're going to start with the knowledge that people are very much committed to reform, that they're willing to work together to achieve it. And so we're very happy to make that announcement today and to work together. Now let me bring up Noble Ray. As mentioned before, when we created this office, the task I had as the director office was to find someone to lead this national initiative, if you will. And Chief Ray, besides having a very long, distinguished career in law enforcement, is also known for being a social justice advocate. He served time as a president of the Urban League. Someone who has practiced what he preaches with regards to policing. And his charge is to not only oversee collaborative reform in San Francisco, throughout the nation, but to work closely with the White House, with the Justice Department, with the field in advancing these recommendations. And so we brought him here today because we want to really make sure San Francisco knew and San Franciscans knew exactly what was ahead of them and the amount of services that we're going to provide and how important this is to us. So I'll turn it over to Noble.
Thank you. Well, I'm not going to take long because I can see people are starting to sweat. Well, good afternoon and welcome. Let me start off by saying that two things. I'm going to cover two things. One is to really explain what collaborative reform is and what it means, so you have a good sense of that. As a federal initiative, this is still relatively new, and I want to get into that, and then talk about the implications with San Francisco, as well as talk about the Open Data Initiative, which I understand the mayor and the chief here has talked about earlier, but we want to talk about that a bit towards the end. We're here today to formally announce the launch of the collaborative reform process for San Francisco Police Department. In the continuum of services the Department of Justice has offered, it was determined, as Director Davis and the U.S. Attorney has mentioned, that collaborative reform process was the best course of action for the San Francisco Police Department. Since we began the Collaborative Reform Initiative for Technical Assistance 4 years ago in Las Vegas in response to officer-involved shootings, the COPS Office collaboration reform efforts have developed a number of excellent responses and has become a resource to law enforcement agencies across the United States. By way of example, we currently have collaborative reform projects underway in Spokane, Washington, Philadelphia, St. Louis, Salinas, California, Fayetteville, North Carolina, Calexico, California, and Milwaukee, Wisconsin. The Collaborative Reform Initiative we will embark on today is just that. It's a collaboration. It is important to note that this is an independent, as what has been mentioned, and I want to continue to emphasize that, an independent, objective assessment that the police department has entered into willingly, and the cooperation to do this is critical for its success. The purpose of a collaboration is to improve trust between agencies and the communities that they serve, providing a means to organizational transformation around specific issues. It is not a short-term solution for a serious deficiency, but rather a long-term strategy that first identifies issues within an agency that may affect public trust, and then offers recommendations based upon a comprehensive strategy assessment for how to resolve these issues and enhance public trust in the relationship between its police and its community. Agency participation in the collaborative process is voluntary, and I repeat, it is voluntary. However, agencies selected to participate must demonstrate a commitment to address the recommendations and undertake significant changes and efforts to reform. I am confident. I am indeed confident that Chief Sir, Mayor Lee, and other community leaders will be good partners in this effort. Let me start by saying how the process starts. It starts by really focusing on getting to an assessment. The assessment process starts by developing some preliminary input. Then we get to some goals and objectives. And these are all community-based goals and objectives involving the police department, the community, community leaders, et cetera. But the goal is to create some goals and objectives that will allow for us to get to a focus on our assessment. Following the assessment, and I will get to the assessment again in more detail, following the assessment, the COPS office will issue a public report detailing the findings along with specific recommendations. There will be a series of reports that will be released. If we're talking transparency, we've got to practice what we preach, and all of our reports will be released. My office will assist assess the progress made towards implementing the findings and recommendations at a 6-month mark, and then again at a 12-month mark, and then again at the end at a 6-month point. The process itself takes roughly about a little over 2 years, where we are releasing reports and we have our experts and COPS representatives that are monitoring the progress that is being made. The goal of the Collaborative Reform Initiative is to help change the way that law enforcement agencies build community partnerships and enhance transparency, transform agencies through decision-making, policies, and establish reforms with integrated accountability systems. To do this, this is the resources that we have on the ground here. To conduct our work, the COPS Office will be enlisting subject matter experts that are among the best and brightest in the field of law enforcement today. They will be conducting interviews with police officers, union officials, command staff, interested citizens, as well as community leaders and advocates. The COPS Office will also bring in technical assistance providers to coordinate the review, conduct interviews, compile the information, and prepare and deliver the recommendations for change. The city will not be asked to contribute any of their own assets to this assessment, other than, as what was mentioned, voluntary cooperation and being available in support of this initiative. We consider this a valuable resource for policing, not just for San Francisco, but we will take what we glean from San Francisco and use it as well as a best practice across the nation. That is why I have been assigned to policing practices and accountability, because we want to replicate some of the things that we may get out of this process across the United States. Collaborative reform is an opportunity for agencies that are looking for progressive and proactive steps and acknowledge that there are challenges and areas of concern. And in the end, they have the opportunity to take part in a transparent process that should improve their practices and strengthen policies and improve their relationship with the community, because that is really the bottom line here when we start talking about building trust. Now, to start this process, we will be back here on February 24th. I will also, along with the team, on February 24th, a Wednesday, the Department of Justice COPS Office will host the first of several listening sessions in San Francisco at a location to be determined. We are in the process of determining the location. I want to emphasize the fact that it is several locations because what we want to do is make sure that we're hearing from those folks that have been directly impacted by some of the issues that we're here today for. So this will be at a number of locations across the city. Let me transition to the last issue and talk about something that is a White House initiative that I alluded to earlier and Director Davis alluded to earlier. As a result of the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing, the President kicked off in May of 2015, he announced the launch of the Open Police Data Initiative. And let me explain what this is all about. The purpose of the initiative was to encourage police departments across the country to make better use of their data. And some of you have you made requests for data, and a lot of times you'll get the annual report that a police department, but that information is usually summarized, and you're not really getting a sense of what's going on. Well, what we're talking about is open data, data that you can actually look at and get a better sense of what's going on. So better use of data in the area of transparency, accountability, and to improve policing outcomes. The goal is for agencies around the country to release data in an open format on things like stops and searches, uses of force, officer-involved shooting, complaints, etc. The Police Data Initiative also helps law enforcement to leverage data to improve systems and processes within policing. We have already seen some promising developing practices on data and technology in the areas of early intervention systems, body camera analytics, monitoring use of force in incidents. And the success of this program is really taken hold. In less than a year, because this was announced in May of 2015, 30 departments have signed on to the Police Open Data Initiative and have released 50 different data sets, everything ranging from use of force, traffic stops, pedestrian stops, community meetings, and a whole lot more. San Francisco has signed on to be a site for the police open data initiative, which is an important first step. The COPS office, as well as the White House, we will coordinate our efforts and support San Francisco in being able to move forward the police open data initiatives. And so that concludes my remarks. I would like to turn it over now to the Honorable Mayor Lee.
Thank you, Chief Ray. Let me express my personal appreciation to Attorney General Loretta Lynch and to Assistant Attorney General Brian Stretch, who answered the call that Police Chief and I made with request to an independent review of our police practices here in San Francisco. You've already heard from Chief Ray and from Director Davis what their approach will be. Well, I wanted to make sure you knew that this request was an open effort to make sure that we have the best practices that we can possibly have and that we measure up to the police practices of the 21st century as the President has articulated. And with the experience of Director Davis and Chief Ray and the others that they will incur to have on their staffs to review, and with the data that we will eventually come out with, we know that it's an expression that our city, our police commission, our Office of Citizen Complaint, our stakeholders in our community, and our Board of Supervisors are all working together to make sure we do everything we can to rebuild trust between our police department and the communities it serves, and to make sure that we're doing it in a verifiable way, in a data-driven way, in a true way, such that it can be reviewed by the Department of Justice so that we can offer ourselves up in a true transparency like never before. And I think this is good for the city. I have asked with the chief that this be done because we, quite frankly, need to repair that trust and move quickly on it. And that doesn't mean that on a day-to-day basis, we give up on everything that we're doing on good community policing, that every single day we're working with our communities to do that. We're working during this great event we're hosting right now to make sure everybody is safe and that we do so and conduct ourselves in the most prideful way and the most informed way with all of our community members. But this review is important to us and important such that we get verification that's truly transparent to everyone, that we are more than willing to be the best standard police department in the country and to put ourselves out there to make sure that we gain the criticism that we need to have in order to be a better city. I welcome this. I applaud the efforts of our Department of Justice to do this and come in. And I know in talking with Mr. Davis and U.S. Attorney Stretch that this is relatively a new service. That in the past, Department of Justice had to kind of force their way into many cities without the needed cooperation. And as Chief Ray said, this is a collaborative effort. We will give up the information that we have. We will allow ourselves to be exposed by way of practices that we have and the practices that we should end and those that we should adopt. This is what modern cities should do to increase the safety of its residents and the trust that we all are in the process of building in everything that we do. And I also want to say that it doesn't just end or start with our police department. This is obviously one of the most important things we're doing with the Department of Justice. But as the mayor, I also have to be focused on education goals. I have to be focused on inequality goals. I have to be focused on affordable housing. I have to be focused on making sure our neighborhoods are never living in isolation like a lot of people feel that they do sometimes, and that it starts the isolated attitudes that occur. That while this review goes on, our city continues to improve itself, involving every community in the city to make sure that our city is responsive. But I wanted to say thank you for DOJ for coming here, and this is just a start. And we will put the necessary resources in so that when there are recommendations that are made, there will be a follow-through with the Board of Supervisors and the city in making sure that we comply, more than comply, that we eagerly seize the opportunity to be a more modern city. Thank you. And with this, Chief Greg Sir.
I too want to join in the mayor's comments in saying how appreciative we are for U.S. Attorney Lynch and the Department of Justice, specifically Director Davis, Chief Ray, Acting U.S. Brian Stretch, for agreeing to help us, to come in and do the collaborative reform initiative, seeing that as the appropriate level of review requested by the mayor. I want to thank him for his leadership in this as well. And I would be remiss if I didn't recognize some of the local leaders on the side. Supervisor Malia Cohen, who is a supervisor of District 10, where the officer-involved shooting of Mario Woods occurred. Our president of the Police Commission, Susie Loftus. Our vice president, Julius Termond, who's in the back. The director of our Office of Citizens Complaints, which is charged with civilian oversight of the police department, Joyce Hicks. And of course, there almost goes without no introduction, Reverend Amos Brown, who from the very onset of this has been requesting independent review. I think it's really important to note that almost immediately after the officer-involved shooting of Mario Woods, it was not lost on anybody that the trust for many residents in San Francisco was shaken. And to that end, I started having conversation with the cops office, specifically Chief Ray and Director Davis, to see if we could engage in a review to whatever level they thought their office appropriate. I was familiar with the Las Vegas Police Department collaborative reform review from some years ago. The 71 recommendations we've already begun to work on with the Police Commission, and I can assure you in all the meetings that we've talked about re-engineering the use of force, which is an issue, as Director Davis said, all departments across the country are struggling with, especially with weapons short of a firearm. We just have to find a way to deal with folks with edged weapon or other weapons, especially folks that are in crisis, with something other than a firearm. And so to that end, in all of our policies, we will speak to proportionality, we will speak to de-escalation, and we will constantly remind the officers of the value of the sanctity of life, of everybody's life, not just the officers, but the public, and then that of the people that we're dealing with who even could be possibly suspects of crime. So it's a work in progress. We've already undertaken the initial start to this. We look forward to this review and the help of the Department of Justice and doing what we can to rebuild the trust that has been shaken.
At this time, we'll open it up for questions. As we indicated before,
Make one comment.
Lebowski.
Yeah, just one thing. I don't know if we put a timeline, and I apologize. So that the community knows how this will work. Over the next, approximately 8 to 10 months will be the assessment. And in addition to the stuff that Chief Ray talked about, besides interviewing officers, and we were looking at thousands of pages of document, looking at uses of force cases going back several years, hosting the town hall meetings, which are for the community, engaging community-based organizations, civil rights organizations. And the one that's usually least talked about and ignored the most would be the youth organizations. What is the voice of the youth in San Francisco that may have concerns, especially young people of color? So a part of that 8 to 10 months is to take a look at documents, practices, policies, internal discipline, early intervention systems from top to bottom. Then we will come out with the report, but we will stay. We will continue to provide technical assistance and if necessary bring in whatever expert we can identify to help along the way, but then give you the public report. And even in our monitoring, our evaluation process, we will continue to engage the community and elected officials because our assessment may be one part, but it doesn't mean much if the community's not seeing and feeling and understanding the same thing. So we're aware of that. We're also aware that people may have difficulty getting to places, so that's why we will move it around the city to make sure that people can have a legitimate voice. Because we know through our procedural justice processes that people have to have a voice. They have to know that city government, city leaders, and the federal government in this case are listening, that we care about it, and that they'll have a fair opportunity to air their grievances and to share their experiences so we can learn from that. With that?
At this time, we'll open it up for questions. As I indicated before, when I call on you, if you could just tell us your name, the media outlet you represent, and to whom your question is directed towards. So at this time, right over here.
Yeah, Steve Seltzer with KPFA. The district attorney a couple of days ago said that he felt that there was an obstruction in the investigation as far as getting documentation. And is your office going to be doing an investigation of fact that even the district attorney can't get documents for the investigation of possible prosecution on the murder of Mario Woods?
So that's a great question. We will, and actually later today, I'll be meeting with the district attorney. My team and I will be meeting with DA Gascon. And as I shared with him, I think our processes are not contradictory. They may be complementary. And one of the evaluations will be looking at the transparency of the department. As far as the specifics, I don't have enough details at this stage to tell you whether or not they should or should not give the documents. I'll leave it up to San Francisco. But when in talking with the district attorney, I'm familiar with the blue ribbon panel he's put together. It's our intent to meet with them as well as many other community leaders to see their perspective. Whatever we find will be open and transparent, and we will share. And if there's, we're going to be very candid. If there is an obstruction, we will make it crystal clear that we see it. But even before waiting 6 to 8 months to hear that, we will share it with the department if we believe that they're either intentionally or unintentionally obstructing. Now, with that being said, I don't know enough to say that that's what's happening. I'll leave that up to the city can respond to that. But our process is about about transparency. So I think we will evaluate that if that makes sense.
Right here.
Dan Kerman with Cron 4 News. How is this different than the Civil Rights Division investigating, the Cops Division versus Civil Rights Division? Right. And is there any requirement to input your recommendations, and would there have been requirements to input the Civil Rights Division's recommendations?
So I think that's a great question, and what the gentleman's referring to is there's another, on the continuum of services that Chief Ray talked about, there's a process called a pattern practice investigation. Now that is a civil process, it's a civil litigation process. The difference is, let me tell you where they are somewhat similar and why the process. The initial assessment, 8 to 10 months, would be, in my opinion, similar to that of the Civil Rights Division, where you're looking at a very in-depth, top-to-bottom review of the practices of the police department. The recommendations and the findings and recommendations we come up, specifically the recommendations, if it's the Civil Rights Division, they can be entered into an agreement with the city and a court, and they are then court enforceable requirements. With our process, it's voluntary, so they're not enforced in a court of law. But I will offer this. They are absolutely enforced in a court of public opinion, which can be just as powerful than a court of law when you have a community that knows what its police department is or is not doing what it's supposed to do and hold it accountable. So we are not a civil litigation process. We're not an enforcement arm of the United States Department of Justice. But I think what the San Francisco community will get is a very in-depth assessment. We'll understand exactly where the department is at. We'll have recommendations that will get them to not only be constitutionally based, but among the best practices in the country in 21st century policing, and the community will then be empowered to hold the department accountable to those standards. And this is where, quite frankly, the mayor comes in. This is where the board of supervisors come in as far as how they embrace and adopt those recommendations as mandates from them to staff, which would include the police department.
Yeah, Vic Lee from ABC 7 News. Was there not a cops review or a cooperation by the SFPD with the COPS program 2 years ago, in which a lengthy review was conducted by your department or your unit of the San Francisco Police Department?
No, I don't believe so. No, we've collaborative forums been around since 2011, and I think we named the 9 cities. San Francisco will be the 10th. We have not done an assessment of the San Francisco Police Department. No.
Next question. Yeah, right here.
Peter came with the LA Times. Is there an element of confidentiality in these interviews, or you mentioned transparency numerous times, but I wonder in the quest for candor of rank and file police officers or community members or whatnot, will they be able to speak freely without maybe having their names?
Well, absolutely. I mean, otherwise it'd be almost impossible to gather the information. So the openness and transparency will be what we learn from the interviews. But the report won't identify that Officer Davis said A, B, or C. That as we go on ride-alongs, as the team goes on ride-alongs, as we talk to officers, that part will be confidential, even to, quite frankly, the police department itself. We will not. So we have opportunities to have interviews. We will talk to the police union. We will talk to, in San Francisco, you have Officers for Justice and other organizations that are also very concerned about. They have their own concerns. We will talk to all of them to see, and this is where you start picking up if there are trends, if there are issues that we should be focusing on. But that part, we will not say who we talk to or the specifics so that we can get people to be very open. I'll tell you what our experience will suggest. If there are challenges that any city, and this is in general because we have not started, we're just now starting the process in San Francisco, One thing I would ask the community to take a look at, and I understand it's tough right now because people are very concerned and trust has been extremely damaged. But in many cases, and I think my experience shows that the overwhelming majority of police officers want to do the right thing. And if any system is preventing them from doing that, or if they see challenges themselves, this is an opportunity where we see around the country, they too become very vocal and very supportive of the idea of change. Who wants to be disrespected or have the community not respect them? I won't say disrespect, let me rephrase that. Who doesn't want their community to respect them and wants their community not to have respect for them? It makes their job safer. It makes their job easier. It makes better crime fighting when you have that relationship. So usually we see a lot of level of support. However, where there's not support, then obviously that would be an issue, and that would go to a culture or a tone within inside any organization.
I have a question. My name is Paulette Brown, and I lost my son 9 years ago to unsolved homicides and the homicides that are going on here in San Francisco. And we want to bring the transparency about the racism about our children's cases not being solved too. I understand Mario Wood's issue, but here I've been on the battlefield. I've met with the mayor, and I've also met with the police chief sir for the last 9 years. And we want our children's cases solved. For mothers like myself, we need to heal. I've been around Leah Cohen, Susan Loftus. Everybody in here knows who I am. And I just come and bring an awareness, not to my son's case, but to every child out there, the mother is suffering in silence, to homicide. So we want our cases solved too. We understand Mario Woods, we understand the police killing, but make the same uproar about our children being murdered also on community violence, the violence that's happening in our community.
If I could say this, and one, I'm sorry for your loss. Let me start with that. And two is I agree with you very much so, in that as we look at building trust between the police department and the community, as we look at engaging in the best practices, we also know that this is also the best way to fight crime, to enhance public safety, to garner the kind of trust necessary that you have much higher case clearance rates so that people will come forth and talk about murders that occur. And I think for us, for a safe community is defined in many ways, and it was not just against police violence, it would be against violence in general. So I think we share that with you. I would say for the Attorney General, I'm going to speak for her and the President. The two are very much linked. We believe that effective, constitutional-based community policing is a way to make our community safer and to establish a relationship. So it's with your loved one in mind and many others that I think this is also very important. It's not about, there may be a triggering case, but I think as you start looking at where the department can head, where we need to go as a nation, it's about thousands of young men like the one you're talking about that lose their lives every day. So thank you very much for that information.
Every day. And I still want to be on the police advisory board, Chief Sir.
Mark Matthews from NBC Bay Area. For either Chief Sir or the mayor, I'd like you to respond, if you would, to George Gaston's letter where he accused the department and the POA of a dizzying array of stonewalling tactics.
I can afford you the letter, but the bottom line is I appear before the Blue Ribbon Committee myself tomorrow. There is no stonewalling, and the documents that the Blue Ribbon Committee asked for were originally afforded to the DA to pass to the Blue Ribbon Committee by whatever authority or law that could be provided. Some of those are confidential documents. The district attorney cited a lack of resources, returned most of those documents to us, saying that this committee was not attached to the DA's office. It was an advisory committee to them. So to that end, the only documents we're able to provide are publicly available documents, and we have provided those.
Okay, in the back, right back here. Tallest hand in the room, right here.
Alex Emsley, KQED News. Chief, I wonder if the DA has said that interviews of rank and file members from that Blue Ribbon panel, that you've indicated that those should go through the POA. Will that also be a requirement for this federal review?
No. Again, we were informed by the district attorney and the Blue Ribbon panel that all interviews with the officers would be voluntary. So as such, they're entitled, like anybody per the Constitution that would appear before the prosecutor's office, to seek representation if they thought that that was appropriate. In this instance, the department has actually asked the Department of Justice to come in, and anybody the Department of Justice coming with the full weight of the Department of Justice wishes to speak to, that's going to happen.
Right through here?
Yeah, Phil Mateer with Chronicle of CBS. This is for the acting U.S. Attorney. Given the history of the San Francisco Police Department, not only in this case, but also with the recent tech scandal, and given some of the concerns of community leaders, could you explain to us if you were asked for a civil rights investigation and why you just, if not, or why you decided not to do a civil rights investigation?
Sure, I think that's fair. So, the federal authorities are, always have their eyes open and receive requests for various kinds of investigations. When we have requests for, say, a pattern and practice investigation, which I believe you're referring to, which is really the next step up from this collaborative reform, it's evaluated by the department. I can't go into the ins and outs of that, but I will tell you that we consult our office locally in the 93 U.S. attorneys' offices around the country, consult with the Civil Rights Division back in Washington, D.C., to determine, based on what we know at the time, whether or not a civil rights investigation is appropriate. So that consultation occurred in this instance, and the decision was made to go forward with collaborative reform. Of course, whatever collaborative reform uncovers, it uncovers, and so the Department of Justice, will continue to pursue, anything that it uncovers in an appropriate fashion.
I want to think to that for me. Yeah. So if I just go back to, I think it was Phil that asked the question. In making a decision, and I understand the community's concerns, a city or jurisdiction may ask for collaborative reform. Usually what we're looking at is what they're asking for is an independent review and investigation. We then, as a process, will take a look at it. And part of the process for me in determining if we're going to say yes is to be in full consultation with the chief, my counterpart, the head of the Civil Rights Division, including conversations with the leadership of the Department of Justice, including the Attorney General, to see what is the best response. Nothing that we're doing today would preclude the Civil Rights Division from coming in if circumstances existed or did not exist, or if changes did not exist that were needed that resulted in what they thought were constitutional violations. So the Civil Rights Division, the Department of Justice, retains its ability and authority to do a pattern of practice if it deems to be necessary. So I want to make that clear. There is no, quite frankly, there's no way around that exposure. The only way around any exposure for a civil rights pattern of practice is by not engaging into constitutional violations, by basically having a very sound police department that would not be justified to do the investigation. So I think this is a very important question, because I'm cautious about comparing the two because they're completely different programs. But they're on the continuum of services that the Department of Justice had, and it is fair to say that the decision of the Department of Justice today is that collaborative reform can work. And a part of that is not just because the police department asked or the mayor asked. A part of it is, in our research, is because you also have a very strong community that's very active and has every intent of holding the department accountable. A part of it is you have a board of supervisors that has been engaging. You have a police commission. You have a civilian oversight board. So if we can empower them with the information and the assistance to do what they were appointed and elected to do, it can absolutely work. If it doesn't, if things change, if we make the assessment we're not getting the full cooperation, or that there is a pattern of practice of constitutional practices that can't be changed through this process, then we will definitely refer the matter back up to leadership and have the conversation with the Civil Rights Division. The only thing that we start with one thing in mind, especially for me, is that we provide the best service to the people of San Francisco, that we help the department live to its promise and what the people in San Francisco deserve. And whatever agency provides that, we would basically take the best opportunity we have. But I think for now, we do believe that this is the best response based on a request. And we got requests not just from the mayor, not just from the police chief, but we also got it from civil rights organizations. We got them from attorneys that asked for even more in-depth pattern practice. So we took that into consideration when we had the discussion.
Last question will come right here.
How can we, the citizens of San Francisco, have confidence in this process, knowing that the Police Officers Association demonstrate total disregard for their oversight body and the public, even in a public police commission hearing? If that's the way they behave in front of their oversight, how do they behave out on the street? And who's holding them accountable? This change needs to happen now. I'm Karen Fleshman. I'm part of the Justice for Mario Woods Coalition.
Now, I think it's a great question, and so I think that's the purpose of the process. If there is this obstruction you're talking about or the culture, then the first way to abate it is to identify it and understand why it exists, where it exists, to what extent it exists, and what practices allow it. In other words, what is it that would allow, this is responding to your question, what would allow such a culture to exist? Where the challenge will not be the first stage of the 8 to 10 month assessment. You're getting the word of the United States Department of Justice that it will be independent. If you look at the Philadelphia report, the Las Vegas report, it would be brutally honest, quite frankly, candidly honest of what we see and we don't see. And I make that crystal clear to any police chief that calls us. You must want to know the truth because it's going to come at you very, very fiercely because that's the obligation. I can't help you. We can't help you if we don't call it like we see it. Now, once the recommendations are there, this is where the city then kicks in. And I think that question you have is a very powerful question. It's one that's appropriate for everyone in the city, including the community and your organization alike. If it doesn't change, I think then you have to take a look at what options we have. So I can't promise what's going to happen after we do the assessment other than we will continue to provide assistance, candid responses. And when we get to that first 6-month report is where you'll get to see what the responses are going to be. So we provided, in Philadelphia, it was 91 recommendations, right? And they're pretty much well on their way of doing it. And as a result of that, just as an example, in Philadelphia, we announced a 6-month report, and their shootings, officer-involved shootings, are down over 40% because of that. Las Vegas, the shootings are down dramatically. Community trust is starting to build back up. That you're looking at. We also identify some very troubling statistics with regards to disparities, racial disparities in unarmed shooting of unarmed African American men. So we'll equip the community with very hard, factual data and information. We will stay side by side and help the department because we see that the leadership is committed to that. But look, I used to live in the Bay Area, but I don't. You know San Francisco. This is your home. You know what people can and cannot do. I will offer this to all the community-based organizations. This is a long-term journey. Let's see if this can work. It doesn't tie your hands. If anything, it empowers you with the information necessary to hold the department accountable. If the changes not being made that you think are appropriate, you have a voice to be able to tell us. If we're not producing it, you have a voice to be able to tell us, and it still doesn't tie your hands because I mentioned before is the Attorney General still has a continuum of options and services that she can call upon. So I think what I would ask is, at this stage where you have a lot of communities that probably feel disenfranchised, and understandably so, where people feel like maybe the department is not listening, is, pause a moment, and this may be a unique opportunity to give voice to that concern, to air that grievance, to share it with us, and see if we can make a difference together. And I think that's the only thing I would ask right now. I'm not going to ask for blind trust that somehow magically overnight things will change, but I would ask for an opportunity to work with you, your organization, your cause, and make sure that we can hear you and that we factor that into our assessment.
We're going to end here. If you do have additional questions.